Last week, we saw CeeDee Lamb, Gus Edwards, A.J. Brown, Sam Howell, Will Levis, and DeAndre Hopkins go off in fantasy football and help people win their matchups. In today's video, I am bringing you 10 players who will do the same, 10 names who will absolutely dominate in week 9 of the fantasy football season. So if you are playing these guys, I'm sorry, you might struggle to win. However, if you have them in your lineups, get ready for a fantastic week. The first name that is going to absolutely dominate in week 9, that is wide receiver Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. He plays the Los Angeles Chargers. Early on for Garrett Wilson, when Aaron Rodgers went down, it was looking quite bleak with Zach Wilson under center. However, in his last 2 games, Garrett Wilson has been rolling, and Zach Wilson is hyper-targeting him as he should. He should be hyper-targeting him, and it's working. They're winning games. In the last 2 games, Garrett is averaging 12.5 targets. That is 5th best amongst wide receivers in that span. He's also averaging 7.5 receptions, 95 receiving yards, and 17.3 PPR points per game. In that span, Garrett Wilson is the wide receiver 12 on a per game basis, scoring more points per game than Keenan Allen, Terry McLaurin, Mike Evans, Christian Kirk, Cooper Kupp, Chris Olave, and Brandon Ayuk in that time span. And now he gets to play the Los Angeles Chargers, who are a fantastic matchup. They give up the 3rd most points to fantasy wide receivers and allow the most passing yards per game to opponents at 297 passing yards a game. That is 34 more passing yards per game than any other team in the NFL. They are by a mile the worst passing defense in the NFL. On average, to fantasy wide receivers, they're giving up 34 points per game. Wilson is seeing a ridiculous 33.5% target share, as he should. This is a fantastic matchup. He will be hyper-targeted again. They will need to throw the ball because the Chargers are going to be able to score. You should absolutely be starting Garrett Wilson. He will feast in week 9. All right, the second player that I believe will dominate here, and this is for all those people out there who are struggling at the running back position. I'm going to give you some confidence to start Chuba Hubbard versus the Indianapolis Colts. You might be sitting there thinking, you're kidding me, Chuba Hubbard? Give me a second, all right? Chuba has slowly but surely taken over this backfield in Carolina. And in week 8, he seemingly made Miles Sanders completely irrelevant. Check this out. Last week, he played 45 of 67 snaps, while Miles Sanders only played 12. And total touches, he dominated, seeing 17 opportunities compared to Miles's 2 carries. 17-2, he beat out Miles. Now, unfortunately, last week, the matchup was good, but it didn't turn into fantasy points. He had volume, but it didn't turn into fantasy points. Now he has another chance to redeem himself with another very, very good matchup. In 2023, the Colts give up the 5th most points to fantasy running backs. By the way, 24 points per game is what they're giving up right now to the running back position. They're also top 10 in rushing yards allowed per game to opposing offenses. Remember, guys, this is the same Colts defense. They haven't made any big moves during the deadline, but this is the same Colts defense that gave up 23 points to Travis Etienne, 26 to Kyren Williams, 17 to Tajay Spears, his career high, and 17 to Jerome Ford, as well as 27 to Alvin Kamara. In a week with so many buys, with so many running backs injured, some of you might need this extra boost of confidence to go out and start Chuba Hubbard. And if you're playing in a DFS format, I think he's a great play in those formats. All right, last week I started a spicy bold take of the week segment on this video series, and I am continuing that today. Remember, last week, my spicy bold take of week 8 was that Calvin Ridley would put up 18 PPR points after bombing on Thursday Night Football the week before. Now, he ended up with 14.3 points, so we barely missed out on that hot take, but he did see 10 targets in a bad weather game. So I'm pretty confident, maybe I'm being, ignorant here, but I'm pretty confident that if the weather was good in that game, that hot take would have hit. And a lot of you guys were like, there's no way. But the 10 targets were there. He was looking good. He was getting open. The weather was just a little bit rough. So here in week 9, my spicy, hot, bold take of the week. Y'all ready for this? I'm going out on a limb, but there's a reason we call it spicy bold, okay? In week 9, Rashod Rice will score a career high in fantasy points versus the Miami Dolphins. He will put up his best ever fantasy points this week versus Miami in Germany, Deutschland. Set your alarms for the early game. Do you guys like these early games? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. I'm not a huge fan because, again, they start at 1:30 a.m. for me where I live, but it is what it is. But Rashod Rice, for a rookie, learning the Andy Reid schemes and offensive system as a rookie on the fly and putting up numbers is not something that we are accustomed to seeing. I mean, remember, guys, last year, Sky Moore didn't really play at all. Rashod Rice has been very, very impressive. And he's coming off back-to-back games with a career high in snap percentages. And in the last 4 games, he's averaging just under 13 PPR points per game. Now, the matchup with the Dolphins is a good matchup. They give up the 10th most points to fantasy wide receivers. But this is not really about the matchup. It's not really about how many points the Dolphins give up to receivers. It's much more about the fact that Rashod Rice will be extremely necessary in what may be a potential shootout. This game has an over-under of 50.5 points, which is the highest over-under of the week in week 9, which Vegas is telling us, they're pretty smart. They're telling us that the most fantasy points will probably come from this game, and it makes sense. It's the Chiefs and Dolphins. And we know Miami can put up huge numbers. They currently average 34 offensive points per game, number 1 in the NFL. No other NFL team is in the 30s. So they're dominating. We know they're going to be able to put up points. If Mahomes is going to bounce back, as I expect, as you probably expect, then Rashod Rice is going to be a huge reason why he does. His current career high is 17 PPR points. So I'm going to go ahead and book it that he will have a new career high after this game in Germany. What do you think about the hot take? Let me know in the comments below. All right, the fourth player that is going to dominate, who's looking for a tight end on the list? I'm bringing you one. It is Dalton Kincaid at the Cincinnati Bengals. Dalton Kincaid's season has officially arrived, ladies and gentlemen. Last week, it was his first game without Dawson Knox, who is currently on IR, and he absolutely smashed it. He played a career high snap share, 84% of the snaps, and turned 7 targets into 17.5 PPR points, which is his highest of his career so far. With Knox out, Kincaid has become a crucial part of this passing offense, and I am loving it. And now it's the perfect storm in week 9. Another huge game and a great matchup. There is not a better matchup for fantasy tight ends so far this year than the Cincinnati Bengals. They give up the most points to fantasy tight ends. Pair that with the fact that this is the second highest over-under of the week, and you can see why Kincaid becomes an instant smash play. I can see a scenario in which both of these teams are putting up big points to superstar quarterbacks with superstar wide receivers on both sides, and you could see Kincaid get into that action. He has got to be starting for you. All right, the fifth player that is going to dominate this week, who's looking for a quarterback streamer? I'm going to help you out here. Dak Prescott at the Philadelphia Eagles. And at first glance, it might, just feel like, really, the Eagles? Great defensive line. They were a great defense last year. They have not been that same defense this year. Their defensive line has been great, but their secondary has been pretty poor. And finding streaming quarterbacks in week 9 is very difficult with the amount of buys and injuries we currently have. However, Dak Prescott started the year pretty rough. He's turned that around recently, and he's had a really good run of form. Let's look at his averages from weeks 1 to 5, and then from weeks 6 to 8 in the last 3 weeks. From weeks 1 to 5, you can see his passing yards are pretty down, but they go up. His fantasy points per game in that first stint, 12.5. From weeks 6 to 8, he's averaging 27 fantasy points per game, and now he plays the Eagles, who give up the 4th most points to fantasy quarterbacks and allow the 7th most passing yards per game in the NFL. This is actually a good matchup, even though it doesn't really seem like it on surface level. Now, not only is this a good matchup, but since the year 2020, Dak Prescott has dominated the Eagles, maybe not in the real NFL, like they've lost games, but he has dominated the Eagles in fantasy football. Check this out. In the last 4 years, Dak is averaging over 33 points per game in a 6-point passing touchdown league against this team. While Philly's secondary has improved with Kevin Byard, we literally just saw last week Sam Howell put up 39 fantasy points. So you got to start Dak Prescott if you're looking for a streaming option. CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, Jake Ferguson, they are all firing on all cylinders, if you will. And Dak should be in lineups for people who need a quarterback play. All right, the sixth player that I think is going to dominate, he's been on this list a couple times. This is the week he breaks out in a big, big way. Zay Flowers versus the Seattle Seahawks. He scored a touchdown before versus Tennessee. Is that a breakout? I don't know. You tell me. But I think this is a big game for him. I know we've been patiently waiting for that huge game. The issue really hasn't been Zay Flowers' play. It hasn't been. I know he had a bad game versus the Steelers, but outside of that game, he's been so good. The issue is the Ravens have not needed Zay Flowers or really any passing option in recent weeks. Remember, Baltimore have dominated 4 of their last 5 games. 28-3 blowout versus the Browns. 24-16 win versus Tennessee, which was never really in doubt. 38-6 blowout versus the Lions, embarrassing them. And last week versus the Cardinals, it looks like a close game, but if you watch that game, the Ravens were never in trouble. They were up the entire game, and they were able to run the clock out. And most of these games, they are managing on the offensive side of the ball. They are not coming from behind. There's not even game scripts. That's been the issue with Zay. It's not been his play. He has looked very good. The good news is, finally we have a game where it should be close and Zay Flowers will be necessary. Both Seattle and Baltimore are top 12 in offensive points per game amongst NFL teams. And the Seahawks are vulnerable through the air, currently top 12 in passing yards allowed per game. And as far as fantasy goes, they give up the 8th most points to fantasy wide receivers. Seahawks are 5-2. Ravens are 6-2. 2 good teams, 2 very good offenses. And if the Seahawks keep this competitive, which they should, we know Zay Flowers is going to ball out. He's going to demand the targets. As of today, he's accounted for 45% of this team's targets to the wide receiver position. I know it's been disappointing in the last couple of weeks, but it's not his fault, and he's finally needed. Start Zay Flowers with confidence. All right, the 7th player that I think is going to absolutely dominate, I'll get to in 1 second. All I ask is, hey, do me a favor and go ahead and hit that like button. It's just a very simple way for you to help this channel grow. We reached 10K subscribers this year, which is awesome. Thank you for the love and for the support. So just go ahead and hit that like button for me. But the 7th player that you should be starting is Joe Moneybags Mixon versus the Buffalo Bills. Finally, last week, this is what we've been hoping for from Joe Mixon. A good week last week, and I think it continues. The volume has always been there this year for Joe Mixon. He's averaging 19.5 touches per game. That's elite type usage, okay? The issue has been the offense has been so bad to begin the year that there was never scoring opportunities, and this offense was not extending drives. Check this out. Cincinnati averaged just 12 total team points per game in the first 4 weeks. 12 total team points in the first 4 weeks. But from week 5 onwards, when Joe Burrow got healthy, that number skyrocketed up to 27 points per game. And like we mentioned for Dalton Conner, we want bodies in this high scoring matchup. The second highest over-under of the week, Buffalo and the Bengals. And the Bills have been a great matchup this year. They give up the 12th most points of fantasy running backs. They're bottom 10 in rush defense. In fact, they allow the second highest yards per attempt in the NFL at 5.1 yards per carry. Only one other team allows more than 5 yards per carry. Start Joe Moneybags Mixon in what could be a shootout, baby. All right, the 8th player that you need to start if you're in a 12-man league at the wide receiver spot, Nico Collins versus Tampa Bay. Nico has been the definition of boom bust this year. In good matchups, he's smashed. In bad matchups, it's not been very good. In his 4 good games where he's had over 10 points, he's averaging 22.5 points per game in PPR. And in his 3 bad games, under 7 points, he's averaging just 6.5 points per game. The good news is, guys, this is a good matchup. The Bucs give up the 9th most points to the position. They allow the 5th most passing yards per game and the 6th most points to opposing teams on a per game basis. So they are top 10 in all those major categories. It's a good matchup. We know the Bucs can score points. this should be a great game for CJ Stroud and Nico Collins. All right, the 9th player that you should start, I'm going to give you one name, but it really is two. Jonathan Taylor should have a huge game in week 9 at the Carolina Panthers. He should be dominant. Now, you can also play Zach Moss, but the caveat here is if Jonathan Taylor is limited by an injury, maybe we lean towards Zach Moss. Right now, I don't see that being the case. Stay tuned to practice reports and any updates before the game. I think JT will be, in his normal workload. But JT has slowly worked back into that workhorse role, which he currently has. Let's look at this. If you compare Zach Moss and JT side by side, you can see when JT came back, he was only playing 15% of the snaps. That went up to 42%, to 50 to 61% last week. And you can see Zach Moss, his snap percentage is going down each and every week, but he's at least still getting at least 10 or so touches a game. Jonathan Taylor should absolutely dominate versus this defense. The matchup is prime. The Panthers give up the second most points to the fantasy running back position on average, allowing just under 29 PPR points per game. So you can start both of these guys, Moss and JT. They're both in play, but I believe we could see a massive day for Jonathan Taylor. And to finish the video, my last player that you got to find a way to start, this is for deeper leagues. If you're in an 8 or 10 man, you're not starting this guy, okay? But I wanted to find a couple streaming options for people who are struggling. This is also a fantastic DFS play as well, so keep that in mind. DeMario Pop Douglas versus the Washington Commanders. This one is very, very simple, guys. Pop has stepped into the wide receiver 1 duties for this team. Kendrick Bourne tore his ACL last week. Juju is Juju. He's not him. And Pop is the most explosive player on this offense by far. Last week, when Bourne went down, we saw Kendrick Bourne lead this team in snaps, routes run, and targets. Now, keep in mind, this matchup is also incredible. It's not just that Pop is going to be the number 1. It's also the matchup is perfect. The Commanders have been awful this entire year, and they just lost their 2 best edge rushers. So Mac Jones is going to be even more comfortable in his pocket. In 2023, the Commanders, this is the second best matchup for wide receivers in fantasy, averaging 36 points per game to the position. The Commanders are. That's what they give up. Genuinely, if you look through their matchups, outside of week 1, the Commanders have been giving up big games to receivers every week. Every week. The same team that was dominated by A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, Drake London, DJ Moore had a career game versus him, and they lost 2 star edge rushers. You got to find a way to start Pop Douglas in deeper formats. But if you're in a smaller league, look to DFS to play him, okay? So that is it for today, guys. Really appreciate you watching. Again, hit that like button for us. Subscribe if you like fantasy football. And if you want a way to support what we're doing here on the channel, everything that you see behind the scenes, it's all us. Every step of the way, we're putting in the work, 60 hours a week, trying to make our goals become a reality. If you want to help support us and get some incredible perks in return, go ahead and check out the Flock Fantasy website. Use our promo code LAND. DM us when you sign up. We'd love to get you all hooked up, and thank you for your support. That is it. Go get a win this week. You got this. Even if you are a 1-win team, a 2-win team, you're 2-6, do not stop. Keep pushing. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy. Even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.